Hello, everyone, again. Welcome to the skeletal system. This is our recording about the skeletal system this week, and it's going to be a short one because the skeletal system, we don't have that many slides to go through, but there's still some things that you have to know. First of all, let's make sure we keep up with those quizzes and, and assignments. They are essential for your grade at the end, especially the assignments, because remember, they're going to count as your final exam at the end of this course. So let's start talking about bones. At System 2, the skeletal system. The skeletal system has a series of functions. Obviously, the most important one is support. Basically, your body would be basically an amoeba or a giant amoeba or a beanbag chair with actually no shape at all, just a bag of skin with hair and holes in it and no shape. With the skeletal system, you have a support system that holds you up and allows you to move the way you do. Protection. Obviously, the bones protect your brain. Your skull is protecting your brain. The ribs are protecting your heart and your lungs. Your backbone is protecting your spinal cord. So yes, all those important organs in your body that require protection are basically surrounded by bone for that protection. Your muscles wouldn't be very useful unless they were attached to bones because there's wiggle. So you need to move the bones in order to get the movements that you want to even pick up a pencil. All your blood cells are made in your bones, your red blood cells and your white blood cells. They're made in a portion of the bone called the spongy bone, which contains red marrow. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. Mineral storage, that means that mostly calcium, which is extremely important for your body's health, especially your muscles and nerves, is stored in your bones. If your body needs more calcium, you have cells called osteoclasts, which are inside the covering of the bone that could actually go into the bone and eat away some of the calcium in there and give it to your blood so your body will get the calcium it needs. Hopefully, if you have enough calcium in your diet, you wouldn't need to do that. But it is a way to get extra calcium by actually taking it out of your bones. Calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate are the two very hard, rocky-like substances that make up the bone inside. The next slide is a diagram of a long bone. This bone is your tibia. Your tibia is your shin. And what it is, it's basically a long bone, and you notice on the top and the bottom of the bone, there is cartilage. The top is the proximal end, and the bottom is the distal end. The cartilage is there because if you remember, cartilage doesn't have any nerves or blood vessels in it. So when it's in the joint between the bones, and the bones move relative to each other in the joint, the cartilage allows you to not feel that. The cartilage gives you a way to not basically scream if the bones rub against each other in a joint, especially if you're standing up and all your weight is on that joint. So that articular cartilage is a way to prevent pain when your bones move against each other in joints. If it wears away, especially with age, the bones will touch each other and you will create pain, and that would be arthritis. Articular cartilage, articulations are joints. So obviously the cartilage is in a joint between bones, and so they call it the articular cartilage. Now, if you look at the bone itself, you'll notice it's basically two parts. There's a top, a middle, and then the bottom, which is similar to the top part. The epiphyses or epiphysis is the top and bottom of the bones. They're the bumpy parts. They create the joints. And in the epiphysis, there is a type of bone called spongy bone. Now, spongy bone is a bad name because it sounds like it should be soft, like a sponge, but it just looks like a sponge. Those little plates in there are actually as hard as a bone is, and so they're not going to be able to be squeezed like a sponge. But in those spaces, in the spongy bone, there is a red substance, and that red substance is called red marrow. And it's in that red marrow where all your blood cells are produced, red and white, and they come out of the bone and populate your circulatory system. And then it's happening all the time because you're losing red blood cells constantly, and you're putting new ones into your body at the same time. That's a nice example of equilibrium. The center of the bone, the shaft, that's called the diaphysis. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone, the long part of it that looks like a stick. Now, in the diaphysis, there is not too much spongy bone. There's another kind of bone called compact bone. Compact bone is very hard, and of course, that's the one that gives you the support mostly. We'll take a look at that under a microscope in a few minutes. The diaphysis is also hollow, and inside that hollow medullary cavity, medullary just means middle, and cavity is the space, obviously. And so the medullary cavity inside of the diaphysis portion of the bone, that hollow area is lined in epithelium, which is not sometimes called the endosteum. It's just an epithelium lining. And inside that medullary cavity is a type of marrow called yellow marrow, which is mostly made of fatty material. In fact, in some, if you lived in Africa, you would see a lion kill a zebra or something, and he would rip that bone apart and suck that yellow marrow right out. It's very nutritious and high in calories. Also, if you look at the diaphysis, you'll notice that there's a thing called nutrient foramen. A foramen is a hole in a bone, and that's a tiny hole. And remember, you'll find out today that bones have blood vessels inside of them. And those blood vessels obviously are taking the new blood cells that the spongy bone is making out into the body. And so you have to have blood vessels that go in and out of the bone. And that hole in the bone allows for blood vessels to enter it from outside the body, outside the bone, and leave the bone to populate the body with blood cells. So the nutrient foramen is a space or hole inside the diaphysis, allowing a blood vessel to go into the bone and out so it can communicate with the body. Unlike cartilage, bone does have blood and nerves. Notice that there is a thing called a periosteum. The periosteum just as simply means around the bone. Peri means round and osteum means bone, and it's the covering of the bone. That covering is dense connective tissue loaded with blood vessels and nerves in the matrix between the cells, and some epithelium tissue. It's bright red in color. So if you actually looked at a bone in your body, it wouldn't look white. It would look reddish because of the covering, the periosteum. When you see a skeleton in the lab, that's been removed, and you just see the white bony material underneath it. So those are the parts of the long bone. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a microscope and take a slice of compact bone and take a look at that under the microscope. And that's the diagram. So if you look at the middle diagram, you'll see it looks like a series of targets with a hole in the middle, or sort of a bullseye in the middle. Those targets are called Haversian systems or osteons. And you notice the bone is made up of a series of those that are all kind of squeezed together. There are layers of hard, compact bone material with cells in between. And so if you look at the diagram, you notice that in the middle of the osteon or the Haversian system, there is a hole, and the hole is populated by a blood vessel. And the blood vessel goes up and down the bone, and some of them go sideways. Those are the Volkmann's canals in the bones. And that's the whole circulatory system carrying blood all throughout the inside of the hard, compact bone. So if you actually broke a bone, it would actually ooze blood out of it, out of the hard, compact bone. And if you look at the osteons, you'll see there's a series of circles, and it looks like almost like little spiders are creating the concentric circles. Those are actually holes, little holes, and inside those holes, which are called lacunae, or one hole is a lacuna, and inside each one of those is a bone cell, and the bone cell is called an osteocyte. And so in each one of those little spider-like things that you see that are creating these concentric circles in the osteon, there is a bone cell, and it's quite alive, and it's nourished by the blood vessels inside. Around the bone, you see the periosteum, and then within the periosteum and between the periosteum and the bone, there are cells called osteoblasts and osteoblasts and osteoclasts. An osteoblast is a cell build new bone. So if you break a bone or crack a bone, those osteoblasts with a B will actually go into the crack and create new bone material to heal the bone. And then they will become the osteocytes within it. Osteoclasts, however, are the bone cells in the periosteum that can go into the bone and eat away some of the calcium in the hard, rocky of the bone, which are the white sections in there, and deliver that calcium to the blood vessels so the body can get the calcium it needs if it's deficient. Now, if you take another look even closer with a higher power microscope, you see the diagram over on the right. That shows you the lacunae, the spaces that look like little spiders in the other diagram. They are filled with cells called osteocytes. And you can see the osteocyte in the lacuna. And notice that the material between the cells, and notice the cells are not connected, so that makes this connective tissue. The material between the cells is all cracked. That's the calcium salts. Those are hard calcium rocky salts, like calcium carbonate, which is basically limestone, and calcium phosphate, both very hard. And within the matrix between these cells, you have these calcium salts that are all cracked. And those cracks are called canaliculi, or little canals. And what they're there for is because the material between the cells is so hard and dense that the nutrients from the blood vessels, like oxygen and the food materials and things, could never get to the cell between, if it has to go in within those rocky materials, unless there was a way to do it. And so you have the canaliculi, all these little canals or cracks in the bone, allowing the nutrients to seep through them and get into the cells. And when the cells make carbon dioxide, that can actually leave the cells and get into the blood vessels and eventually get into your lungs, and you breathe it out. So the canaliculi are little cracks in the matrix, the bony matrix between the cells. And they are very important because they allow the cells to stay alive, because they can get nutrition from the blood vessels in the Haversian and Volkmann's canals inside of the bone, and also get rid of their waste that way. Now remember, bones have blood vessels in them. They do bleed, and they do have nerves, and they do hurt if you hit them. If you ever, hit your shin on an open door or an open drawer on a desk or something, you notice that doesn't feel very well. That's because the bones do feel pain. So that's basically the fine and the gross and the fine structure of bone. The gross structure is what you see without a microscope. That would be the left long bone. And then the things with microscopes, the middle picture and the last one over on the right, that's the structure of the bone. That's what you see if you need a microscope. Now, the next slide shows you a couple of diagrams that shows you the Haversian systems and how the bones are put together. You can see all those concentric circles, barely see them in there, but they are almost like little targets, and those little black dots are the Haversian canals with the blood vessels in them, and you can see the blood vessels over on the side there. The Haversian canals are drawn a little bit so you can see the concentric circles of bone material with the cells in between them. So it's a nice little three-dimensional diagram for you. Now this one is a picture of our skeleton. And what you're going to need to do on a quiz is you're going to have to be able to identify these bones. This is not going to be on the quiz you're going to take this week, but it's on the next one. And so let's go over the skeleton's bone materials here. The bones on the top of your head, you have two bones that basically form the top of your skull, and they're literally sewn together. It looks like they're like puzzle pieces locked together. That kind of a joint is called a suture, and it's immovable. You can't move those bones relative to each other, which is kind of a good thing. The parietal bones, you notice the number next to them, it says 2. That means you have 2 of them. You got one on each side of your skull, on the top of your skull, and you have a suture joint in between. A frontal bone is your forehead bone. The occipital bone is the bone in the back of your head, and it actually goes under your skull, under the skull as well. The temporal bone is the bone on the side of your head, and you have two of those because you got two sides, and that's the one that has the hole for your ear in them. That's the temporal bone. The zygomatic bones are your cheekbones. The maxilla is your upper jaw bones. You have two of them. You have a little joint in between them, and they have your upper teeth in them. And then the mandible is your lower jaw, and the lower jaw, of course, is the only one in your skull that actually can move. It actually movable joint. It has a hinged. Nasal bones are the two little bones on the top of your nose. The rest of your nose is cartilage, so it can wiggle back and forth in the front of it. But the top of your nose is two nasal bones. And you have bones that are inside your eye socket as well, but we're not going to name all those bones right now. We're just going to look at this diagram first. Now, there's one called a sphenoid. It looks like a little triangle on the side of your head there. And you notice that the sphenoid is a little triangle, but there's no number next to it, which means there's only one of them. So how could you have only one sphenoid if it's only on the side of your head? Then what about the other side of your head? Well, the answer to that is because the sphenoid bone actually goes all the way across the inside of your skull and forms the base upon which your brain sits. And so it is actually on bone, but it appears as little triangles on either side of your skull. Your neck is your cervical region, and you have 7 cervical vertebrae there. Giraffes also have 7. They're just a lot bigger, and they are forming the vertebrae of your neck. A lot of car accidents and things like that happen because injuries happen because the skull is just sitting on the neck there, and it can bounce back and forth pretty well and actually damage the cervical vertebrae and cause neck damage. Now, if you go down a little bit, you see that there's clavicles. Clavicle is your collarbone, and it's attached to the humerus on the other side. On the back of you have 2 scapula. Scapula are the scapulae are the shoulder blades, and they also form part of the joint with the arm. Then you get down to the ribs here, and you have 3 kinds of ribs. You have 7 pairs of true ribs. They go around, come out of the vertebrae in your back, and they go around and actually attach to the sternum directly. And so you have 7 of those. They just go around and protect your lungs and your heart. At the very ends of those bones is cartilage. They don't attach to the sternum as bones. They attach to the sternum as cartilage so that the rib cage can actually stretch when you breathe. If it was all bone, you wouldn't be able to breathe because they wouldn't be able to give. Then you have 3 other bones called false ribs, which are really ribs. It's just a silly name for them. And what they do is they come around, but there's no more sternum left to attach to. So what they do is they come up and they attach to the bottom of rib number 7. And they're called false ribs. You got 3 of those. So you have the true ribs and the false ribs. 7 and 3 make 10. And then you have 2 more. They're called floating ribs. And you can barely see one. If you look at the word floating rib there, you'll see that it's pointing to a rib that just comes out of your backbone and just goes a little way up. And it doesn't come around at all. And it has a little point on the end and can damage your internal organs if you have a car accident or a motorcycle accident. A lot of internal injuries are caused by them. And they're just called floating ribs. So you have 2 floating ribs on either side. You have 3 false ribs and 7 true ribs. So you add them up, that's 12 and 12. So you got 24 ribs altogether. The vertebrae underneath the rib cage are lumbar vertebrae. The ones that actually have the ribs on them are called thoracic vertebrae. And then the lumbar are below them. You have 5 of them, and they're the largest of the vertebrae. And all the vertebrae have cartilage pads in between them to prevent pain and give your backbone some ability to move. If you're going to have back problems, it's almost assuredly going to be down in the lumbar region, because that's the one that's when we stand up, almost all our weight is on those. And you have underneath that, you have a bone called the sacrum. The sacrum is a little triangle-shaped bone with lots of holes in it. It's really just a bunch of fused vertebrae, and it forms part of the pelvic region. The holes are there because the spinal cord going through the vertebrae actually branch and goes down into your legs through those holes. The ilium are the two shovel-like bones in your pelvis. They're kind of holding up your intestines and organs within you, and they are what basically forms your hips. And then you have the ischium, which are those two little donut-shaped bones underneath, also with holes in between so that blood vessels and nerves can go through them. And then in the middle, you have two little bones. They're smack in the middle there. And in between the two pubic bones is a pad of cartilage. Because when you move the whole pelvis, kind of one goes one way, one goes the other way as you walk, and so the pubic bones would rub against each other. So you have a nice pad of cartilage there in order to prevent the pain. Those are the pubic bones. So your pelvis is basically made out of three bones on each side: your ilium, ischium, and pubic. And they're all fused together. There's no movable joints between those three bones. And on the other side, you have another ilium, another ischium, and another pubic, all fused together. In between the two pubic bones, you have a pad of cartilage. Then you have the coccyx. The coccyx is your tailbone. It actually is a series of very small vertebrae that become the human tail, and they actually curve forward. They don't come out of the unless there's a mutation or something like that in the baby. The femur, down your legs now, the femur is the largest bone in your body. That's your thigh bone. And the patella is your knee. You got two of those, obviously. And in the lower leg, you have two fibula. Fibulae are the skinny little pencil-like bones that go in your lower leg, easy to break. And your tibia is the larger one, and that was the bone we just looked at in the last slide when we took it apart to see the parts of the bone. In your foot, you have tarsal bones. Tarsal bones are the bones in your ankle, and they have joints between them. They're almost like little ball bearings. They can move very well over each other and gives your ankle a very, very wide range of movement. The calcaneus is your heel, and the metatarsals are the fleshy part of your feet, and the phalanges are your toes. And if you go up to the arm, the upper arm is your humerus. And then you have a joint between the humerus and your lower arm bones. The radius goes toward the your thumb, and the ulna goes toward your pinky. And they are the radius and the ulna, the lower arm bones. There's two of them. And then your carpal bones are your wrist bones. And again, they have those gliding joints. So the carpal bones, there's 8 of them, and they can move over each other fairly well. And you can get a tremendously good range of movement with your wrist. You can move your hand basically any way you want to. And then inside the fleshy part of your hand are the metacarpals, and then the phalanges again form your fingers. Okay, so there are the bones, and you'll have to recognize them in some form. We'll probably give you a multiple choice question asking you things like, what is your upper arm bone called, and there'll be 5 choices, and you pick the right one. Then we get on to the next slide here. Next slide is about joints. Now, again, you have immovable joints in your body where bones come together, but they can't move relative to each other. And the best example of those are those sutures I showed you in the skull. All those bones in your skull, except for the mandible, except for your lower jaw, are actually, in a sense, fused together. They are hooked together by just exactly what happens with a puzzle. You have those nice little pieces that can come together, and then you can't pull them apart very well. They're immovable joints. Slightly movable joints would be that little bit of vertebrae, a little bit of cartilage that's found between your pubic bones and your pelvis. Slightly movable. They would also be the cartilage in between the vertebrae of your back as well. Symphysis pubis is that little pad of cartilage between your pubic bones and your pelvis. Synovial joints are the movable joints. They call them that because there's a fluid in there, an oily fluid that lubricates the joint, just like the oil lubricates the engine of your car. It's called synovial fluid. Gliding joints are the ones in your wrist and ankle. We talked about those. They're small bones which can move relative to each other pretty well and give you tremendously good range of movement, both in your foot and in your wrist, in your ankle and in your wrist. The hinge joints work like a door. So you have your elbow and your knee, they're hinges. Just like a door, they open and close. Saddle joint is only found in your thumb, and basically it looks like a saddle on a horse, and it can move back and forth pretty well. That's why you can move your thumb a lot more different ways than you can move the fingers. The fingers are just examples of hinge joints. They can just hinge. They just, like turn, like a door. They have a hinge joint. But the saddle joint on your thumb gives you more of a range of movement with your thumb. And that's why we can pick things up and make tools and all the things that allow humans to evolve into what we are today. Pivot joints are joints that actually spin around each other, and a good example of those would be the first two vertebrae. The first vertebra is your atlas, and Atlas was a Greek hero that actually held up the earth, and so your atlas is your first vertebrae. It's holding up your skull, which is your world. The axis is the second one. The second vertebra on your neck, the second cervical vertebra, has a little tooth sticking up out of it. And coming from that tooth are ligaments that are attached to the bottom of your skull. And when you say no, when you move your head back and forth, you're actually doing a pivot. And that's an example of a pivot joint. There are pivot joints between your radius and your ulna and your arm, so you can actually spin your arm back and forth pretty well. Ball and socket joints are just what they sound like. You have a round ball-like structure that fits into a socket, and it can move around almost 360 degrees. That would be your hips and your shoulders. And so those are the different kinds of joints. Now, a picture of them would be this slide here. This is the and you'll notice there's your humerus bone, and then the bursa is a little sort of fluid-filled sac that kind of lubricates the bone and protects the bone and cushions the bone a little bit. Sometimes that can leak and you could have issues, or it can get inflamed and you have bursitis. You have one of those in your knee as well. The joint cavity, that whitish area you see there, that contains that synovial fluid. So you notice that it is cushioning the bone in the joint between other bones and also lubricating it. And the whole thing is surrounded by that articular cartilage we talked about to prevent bones from touching each other and causing pain. So it's a nice little diagram showing you how the synovial joints are put together. Some of the things that can go wrong with your joints. Now, again, these won't be on quizzes. This is more of a clinical thing, but I thought, again, it would be interesting for you. Bursitis is the inflammation of those bursa, usually caused by either a blow or some kind of friction that happens in the movements that you make. That's called bursitis. Tendinitis is an inflammation of your tendon sheaths. Tendons are the connective tissue that actually holds the muscles onto the bones, and it's basically continuous with the periosteum of the covering of the bone. So it's almost impossible to pull a muscle off a bone. You have to really try. Arthritis is when your articular cartilage kind of wears away or gets inflamed. And there's, again, over 100 different types of arthritis, and it's very widespread, crippling disease in the United States. Osteoarthritis is the most common kind, and that's just basically old age. The cartilage basically wears out in those joints, and the bones in your hands and your wrists and your knees and so on. They just kind of touch each other and start to really hurt, and some of them can even grow into each other, and so you actually lose the ability to move the joint. Rheumatoid arthritis is actually caused by the immune system, and your immune system can actually attack the joint itself and cause the the cartilage to disintegrate and cause all sorts of problems with inflammation and so on. And you can be fairly badly deformed. And you don't have to be old for that one. You can get this in as early as in your 20s or even earlier, because it's your immune system doing it to you. It's not age. And finally, gouty arthritis is inflammation of joints caused by the disposition of crystals in your blood. And if people eat a lot of protein, one of the things that happens when you eat a lot of protein is you create a lot of ammonia and urea in your blood. And that urea can be converted to what's called uric acid. And uric acid is solid crystals. And they can accumulate in your joint, causing tremendous pain. And that's normally called gout. It can be controlled with diet if you don't eat as much protein. So basically, that's the information you need to know about the skeletal system. Remember to keep up to date with the homeworks and the quizzes, and everything seems to be going smoothly. Next week, we'll talk about muscles. Okay, that's it for this week.